diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it is important to consult and oftentimes be a part of those communities. There are a few folks that do some trainings here in this area, so it's been important for me to be not just a self-proclaimed advocate and ally, but someone that the community would state that I am an advocate and ally. So I just want to make sure that I provide that information. And also, there may be those that are a part of the LGBTQ plus community in this space. Please feel free to chime in. I'm certainly not going to lean on your stories and experiences because that is not my place. However, I do want anyone to feel if they want to add something or share their experiences to feel like they can in this space. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a Kansan. I am in the Midwest, so you may have some differences. There may be some other language. What we know is culture, language can be regional, it can be local. And so if there are some things that you all would like to interject in the areas that you reside in, please feel free to share that as well. So that was my quick caveat, and I am glad to be able to be here with you all this morning. So we'll hop right into co-creating the space, which includes the engagement guidelines that I would love for you all to continue to utilize and share in your circles, in your spaces. Oftentimes, the usual suspects show up to the diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, workshops, programs, what have you. It's where you all take this conversation that I cannot go, right? How you all continue to have dialogues with your family members, your friends, your peers, the organizations that you represent, your places of worship, whatever that may be. How are you taking what you're learning in these spaces and providing your influence thought process in that by educating those around you? So please continue to have these conversations as you move forward. For those of you that are new to the term Conversation Catalyst, we have an organization right here in Wichita, Kansas called the Kansas Leadership Center, where Ed O'Malley is the former CEO, has since taken a role with the Kansas Health Foundation, which is an organization they're both connected. But Conversation Catalyst really comes from that space where we are looking to be agents of change. And so many of the facilitators that I work with under Inclusive Growth Strategies and with the Kansas Leadership Center have taken on the name Conversation Catalyst. And my hope is that you all will be catalysts of change as you continue these dialogues in the spaces that you are in. Continue to be present and respectful in this space. It's Friday morning, right? It's easy to be checking emails and being everywhere else. I ask that you try to be as present as you possibly can. I forgot to say this last night, but if you have the ability to join me on camera, please feel free to join me. I know some folks aren't in this space or might not have camera capability, but if you do, it's just nice to see some friendly faces looking back at you as we engage as well. We won't be doing a lot of breakouts because it's a little bit more information heavy than prior trainings, but we will have opportunities for dialogue within this space. I know we're a larger group today, but I do hope that folks feel like they can be candid and engage when those timeframes come. Challenge yourself to understand others' perspectives. There are a lot of perspectives on LGBTQ plus topics specifically, and so we want to be as open-minded as we possibly can and lean in to the discomfort that may arise in this conversation. Embrace being reflective. There are timeframes where I want you to think about your part in systems. I want you to think about your experiences and really see how you're showing up as an ally. Maybe there are some allies on this screen already. Maybe there are folks that are not willing or not wanting to be an ally just yet, but you're just here for the information, and that's important too. So let's ensure that we are being reflective and in this space. Park the car or land the plane. I love both of those statements. Please ask your questions, say your statement so we can have a fruitful dialogue and really walk away from this learning space. This is very much that. It's an opportunity for us to educate one another and stay up to date on some of the terminology and the things that are going on within community and outside of community. Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence. You still may step in it. It happens to the best of us, but an intentional apology with the ability to learn and grow and not make the same mistake, right? Apology for apology's sake really doesn't do much. Apology with follow-up action and change, repentance, if you will, creates an opportunity for us to really be able to move forward and grow and learn from those mistakes. Stories stay, lessons leave. My hope is that you all share a little bit about your own walks, your own life, regardless of the communities that you identify with. But we want to ensure that we don't let those stories leave this space as gossip or sharing other people's business, but what are the principles we can learn from one another? Again, continue the dialogue with others, and we'll continue to lean into discomfort with grace. If we have some grace and respect in this space, it'll go a long way. As I continue with conversational expectations, this is a safe space. We want to ensure everyone's opinions are heard and that we are engaging with one another. Most of us were raised in a homophobic society, that is to include or culture LGBTQ plus folks, right? Where we experience and have seen and have grown up with stereotypes generation after generation after generation. So how are we challenging ourselves to break away from those stereotypes, particularly if we're not proximate or we don't think that we're proximate to LGBTQ plus communities? And then understanding that we're all at different levels with the understanding. There may be folks on this call that are a lot more educated than myself. I welcome your input. Had some great takeaways yesterday and some things that were shared. So please, again, feel free to be a part of this learning community in this time frame. Many of you, I'm sure, practice mindfulness. If you do not, I encourage you all to take some time to learn more about the importance of mindfulness and how you can be present and how we can really take the time to grow radical empathy through mindfulness. As we're making or taking that moment, I would ask for you all to take a couple of deep breaths, get as comfortable as you possibly can in this space. You need to get your feet level set, whatever you need to do to ensure that you are here with us in this moment, that would be very helpful. But let's be prepared to clear our minds and let's reflect on the following quote: strong communities are born out of individuals being their best selves. Strong communities are born out of individuals being their best selves. When we think about the ability to be your authentic self, to be your best self, how much stronger would our communities be if they could show up authentically? And when we think about our mental health, when we think about our well-being, when you are your best, you're willing to show up your best, right? In the workplace, in your community and society. So that starts at the individual level. And from there we go to your neighborhood, to your community, to your city, to your county, to your state, to your region. But that only can start when someone can feel like they can be their authentic self. And that's something that we'll focus on a little bit here today as we move forward. So I thank you all for joining me this morning as we move forward. So in this space, the goal of the LGBTQ plus cultural awareness and allyship workshop this morning is really to educate and create and sustain a welcoming, inclusive environment wherever you are, right? It starts with you and your spaces and the influence that you have, be it on policy, hiring, the communities you work with, the families that you work with, whatever it is you do in your profession, in your personal life, where can you make the differences? I used to work at Wichita State University, so our trainings oftentimes are adapted from what we like to call at the university safe zone. There are corporate organizations that do that as well in a gender diversity training, but this creates for you all is really to provide a safe and supportive network for those that identify in the LGBTQ plus and queer communities. We want to be able to make sure that these spaces are highly visible. You may have the opportunity, if you've not done so already, on a campus or in a corporate setting, to go through a training such as this, and then you might get a little certificate or a little something to put on your office window, your backpack, whatever that looks like, to say, I am a safe place, or this office is trained, and this is a safe zone office. There are a lot of those types of things that happen. So you all may consider the ongoing opportunities for education in your areas and how you visibly put something out to say, hey, we're trained here, right? It doesn't mean you're all knowing. I don't want you all to walk away with that, right? You come to one workshop, you're starting the process, or maybe you're an ongoing learner, which is great. But it's important to also say, at least I know the resources, but the expectation is for you to not be the all-knowing person. Just know where to go and where to point folks in your areas, in your communities. Our learning outcomes today are as follows. You'll learn some LGBTQ plus terminology. It will not be all comprehensive because, again, when we think about language and areas, you'll get a basic understanding using inclusive language, understanding the differences between sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, the process of coming out, how to respond to homophobic, transphobic incidents, the power of allyship, and then some additional resources will be sent out to you from Tracy, such as a pronoun sheet, that sort of thing, so you all can continue the work, because in order to be a strong performer, you got to practice, right? Nothing, you don't become an expert overnight. It's what you continue to work on and learn. So thank you all this morning. And for those of us that are still joining this morning, if you have the ability to join me on camera, I would invite you to do so. We do have a full house. So again, if you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand. I'll ensure that we're looking at the chat and trying to get to those as best as we possibly can. So that being said, I've already used a couple of terms already. We want to make sure that we are all on the same page. We will start at some basic 101s. You have sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And we'll just read as follows. Sexual orientation is the enduring pattern of sexual and romantic attraction towards one or more genders. Gender identity being the gender which a person feels fits them the most. And gender expression is a presentation and performance of gender based on cultural norms. The cultural norms I will be referring to in our workshop today is going to be around the American context. I cannot speak to the context of really the worldview because I'm not coming from the worldview. So I also want us to understand there are different cultures and culture views gender differently. So again, I'm coming from the US context here. If there are folks here that are coming from other countries or spaces that want to kind of share how they look at gender, please feel free to jump in and share those pieces, please. You also see here, just in connecting the dots. So when we think about gender assigned at birth, we can just start right there. Gender assigned at birth is how the medical community labels you, right? You come out of the womb, you get smacked on the booty. I don't know if they still do that or not. I said that last night. Maybe they don't do that anymore, unless you just come out crying, maybe. But at this point, you're assigned a gender at birth, right? You either get male or female, they tell you that, right? Now, whether you end up identifying that way is a different conversation, but the medical community does deem you male or female, potentially intersex, but we will get into that conversation here in a moment more on that definition. So when we continue to connect those dots, then you think about your gender attribution, how people perceive your gender. So how do people believe you show up in the world, how they attribute and interact with you? And that might be based on your social norms and expectations. That might be cultural norms. That might be how they perceive your gender expression and any of those things. So how your gender is attributed to you, and then your gender expression. So all the ways in which you communicate your gender, maybe that's your hairstyle, your clothing, your makeup, nail polish or not, how you present yourself to the world, right? How you express that, or maybe you're not expressing a gender, you're just expressing yourself. It's important to not get stuck in the thought process of trying to assume what someone is, right? And I think that that's where we get stuck is, well, I don't know what the right language is and how am I supposed to know? And just learn and be open. But one of the best things you can do is let someone tell you how they identify and respect it. Respect someone's identity by how they share it with you, from their pronouns to their names and all of that. And then of course, gender identity being at the heart of that. And I provided the definition there, but really who you internally know yourself to be. Even if you've never received a message about that social expectation of gender, you yourself know, regardless of what was assigned to you at birth, you know how you identify. And that may be within the gender binary, male or female, that might be on the spectrum. I believe that gender, sexual orientation, I believe many things fall on a spectrum. And it provides you an opportunity to identify as how you identify and our ability to respect people's identifications. Questions so far? Okay, well, I'll leave some space, and my apologies. My good old computer is doing all the things as I try to get it to move forward. Okay, we will continue on. So cisgender. Cis meaning in the Latin derived prefix on the same side. You may have heard this term cisgender. A person whose gender identity is the same as the gender they were assigned at birth. So I'll use myself for an example. I was identified as female at birth. I still identify today as a woman. All of those things for me align. My gender identity, how I perform that gender, how I believe I perform my gender, I identify as a woman. All of those things are in line in that way. Transgender, the Latin prefix of trans meaning on the other side of. So in this space, an umbrella term describing a person whose gender identity is different from the gender they were assigned at birth. And then non-binary, an umbrella term for a person whose gender identity does not align, again, with the binary gender of man or woman. So someone that is not subscribing to either one of those assigned genders. There's also some flags that go with these varying identities. I will not go into all the colors and the history, but I would encourage you all to continue that education. And we most recently came off of Pride Month and Juneteenth, which is very exciting. And I love to see some of the cross sections in both of those communities and in that space, but taking some time to look at where the flags come from, who did the flags, what the colors mean. They do have very individualized meanings. So those two flags right there are for transgender and non-binary. And then we see the intersex flag here, intersex. And this is where folks tend to get confused. A person whose primary, secondary sex characteristics don't fit expectations of male or female. For example, a baby being born with both maybe testes and ovaries. And certainly I cannot speak for the medical community. That's not why you all invited me here today. But what we know is the miracle of birth, there are many of things that can happen. And when we think about at one point in time, doctors not even having conversations with families would determine someone's gender at the time, even when that child would have both primary and secondary sex characteristics. Families had to make decisions on how their child would identify. And that still happens today. Really, though, it's unethical for a doctor to just come in and not share every piece of what's going on with your child at that time, and being able to make those decisions in that space. But we do, in fact, have folks that are born with many genetic changes, anomalies, all types of things happen, right? When we think about the miracle of birth. I'm not going to go down that line because we've got a lot of stuff going on in law right now. So I'm not going to pigeonhole us there, but understanding that no, it's not as simple as someone just is born with an XY chromosome. Lots of things happen, and particularly when you're a part of the medical community, you have a little bit more of a background in being able to share that. So if you want to learn more about what it means to be intersex, again, I would encourage folks to go in and learn a little bit more, because what I'm able to share in our hour and a half today is going to be very brief, but giving you just that one-on-one opportunity to continue to get that information. Gender queer, a person who does not subscribe to gender distinctions, may identify as neither, both, or a combination of genders. Gender fluid, and again, is it kind of as a giveaway in the name, a person whose gender identity is fluid or changing. Two-spirit, an umbrella term that encompasses gender identities recognized in indigenous North American cultures. Right, and so it would be inappropriate for those outside of the indigenous community to claim being two-spirit, as that would be cultural appropriation. So also understanding culturally what and how folks identify within their LGBTQ plus identity and the intersection of their culture. Gender binary, and we oftentimes think in a binary because as people, and we think about, if you've joined my implicit bias training, when we think about just how we're programmed, we think very binary ways, right? You're either a man or a woman, you're either gay or straight, you're either Republican or Democrat. But what we know is folks fall within the spectrum on all things in their identifications. So when we think in a spectrum, it's easier to wrap our minds around these concepts and how folks, in fact, identify. As we move forward, you may have heard, and I'm using the term LGBTQ+. There are some folks who are maybe in areas or have been in spaces where they use the full spectrum of the letters. You may have heard LGBTQIP2SAA, right? And there's different ways to go through that. I just stop at the plus so that I can encompass the changes and the edits as things move forward. That meaning lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, pansexual, two-spirit, androgynous, and asexual. And we will get into some of those other pieces. Again, do not get stuck on having to feel like you need to memorize and know everything. That's not how this works. A commitment to continuous learning, right? When we think about cultural humility and commitment to respect to those around you, and respecting and honoring how someone identifies will go a long way. This is an opportunity for us to engage, because I've been talking at you for a little bit, mainly with definitions. So I want to hear from you all. When did you first learn about gender diversity? So when you kind of reflect on your life, when did you realize, oh, okay, there's more to this thing called gender? There's more than just this thought process that there's a binary. And I'll look at the chat as well, but anyone willing to share on when they first learned about gender diversity? Okay, Regina, I see age 10-ish. Okay. Others, any experiences that you can recall that made you realize that there's varying ways for folks to identify? If I can verbally hear from one person willing to share their experience and engage this morning. High school, generally hearing queer. Okay.
Hi there. I'd like to share my experience. My name is Diego Rivera, and my first experience with learning about gender diversity was around the age of 16, 17. At my high school, there was this young person who came in and they expressed themselves in a very different way than any of us did. And actually, they started a gay-straight alliance at our high school. It was quite conservative. And I remember that this person would express their gender very, very differently. They got a lot of criticism, and I became very curious. And also, I did have a lot of, at the time, I was 16, 17, I lacked a lot of knowledge, but there was a little prejudice that I also partook. But throughout time, I unlearned those biases, and I learned why they were there. And I became even more curious and started to learn more about gender diversity and how it manifested and how natural and organic it really is. And even till now, I love learning about uh, different types of expression. And I think it's great. And I look back now and I wish I could support them a lot more. And yeah, that's just some of my experience.
There you go. Thank you for that. I appreciate being candid, right? Because what we know is we all have stereotypes. We all have had these experiences, or folks or family members or caregivers tell us what to believe. So being able to experience community for yourself and having that understanding is important. Genevieve, and let me know if I'm pronouncing
Hi.
names
Yes, that's
incorrectly.
perfect. Yes,
Okay.
thank you. I just wanted to share that I first learned about this as a young child, and it was in a negative context. Like I would hear people, it was a family member that other family members would talk about in a negative way. So that was my first experience with it.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you. Yeah. And then in the chat, I'm seeing during high school, college, right? Many of us have had some sort of experience or early conversations, be it good, bad, indifferent. There have been some sort of experiences. I'm seeing it in the chat. I'm 52 now. My awareness was, I just moved. I'm 52 now. My awareness was from observation versus by definition. Identity, gender, and fluidity made sense to me despite binary constructs. Thank you. And then Brittany, lots of transphobic stereotypes in the media when I was a kid, absolutely. And still today. Didn't understand gender diversity until college, especially when a few friends shared they identified as non-binary, right? Any caregivers in this space now, when we think about our children growing up and what they're seeing, right? From what's on TV, what's a little bit more accepted, but certainly folks are still experiencing violence, hurt, hate in these communities. But we're seeing a little bit more of a normalization on gender diversity as this next generation is starting to experience and share their identities. Did you all, and this is kind of a given because you all have spoken to that, but did you observe any stereotypes or misconceptions from your first impressions of gender diversity? And you all have already kind of shared in that space. If I can hear from someone on how has your understanding of gender changed throughout your life? Diego really put his story beautifully out there. Is there anyone else that might want to share on, how do they look at gender diversity today versus the first moment in which they experienced it? And I'll throw this second question in here too as we can move along. What first impressions are you still in the process of unlearning? Anyone doing any unlearning at this point? Scrolling through my screens here. Okay. Well, I'm going to move us forward. We had some great feedback in the chat. Something coming in. Hearing it was from Diana, hearing it was wrong, especially at church. They were sick. Homosexuality was evil. Definitely learn to respect all and try to be a safe person and have a safe place around me, just trying to be more aware and understanding. Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely, right? And there are often messages and spaces where it is accepted to be hateful, hurtful, and particularly when we think about religion. Now, I'm not going to spend time slamming religions, because what we know is there are affirming churches, faiths, and religions, right, across different religious backgrounds. But there are also churches that are not affirming, right, and having to reconcile how we were raised in some of those communities. I grew up Pentecostal here in Wichita, so that might look differently in spaces. And I did grow up in a church that stated that folks in the LGBTQ plus community were not going to heaven and all of that. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But what we know is being proximate to community can really change your thought process and stereotypes. And then lastly, I see from Brittany, learning the lens that gender is on a spectrum was really helpful to deconstruct that internal binary. Thank you for that. And thank you all for engaging. We're going to now transition into the sexual orientation side. Again, let's not get caught up between gender diversity and sexual orientation. The best way to know how someone identifies is how they tell you they identify. And I will continue to say that you do not have to guess someone's sexual orientation, right? It's not for you to guess. It's for folks to identify the way they would like. Go ahead, Tracy.
Just that Regina had a comment as well.
Thank you. Regina, not having assumptions about identity of others based on aesthetics, essentially, starting from fluid versus needing to be redirected. My 16-year-old has been my teacher and advocate. Yes, right. Young folks have a way of getting you together. Right, they will get you all the way together. All right, and we're going to go into orientation. Again, we'll see some flags as well. Take some time to dig a little bit deeper in that. So lesbian, a person with a feminine gender identity who is sexually and romantically attracted exclusively to other people with feminine gender identities. Gay, also uses a umbrella term across the LGBTQ plus spectrum, but also meaning a person with a masculine gender identity who is sexually and romantically attracted exclusively to other people with masculine gender identities. Again, also used as an umbrella term. Fun fact, the rainbow flag actually came from someone out of Kansas. That person is no longer alive, but it's just good to know that we have folks in community that care enough to create, even in spaces that seems fairly conservative, to move communities along. And then bisexual, a person who is sexually and romantically attracted to people of at least two gender identities. Asexual, a person who experiences little to no sexual attraction to others and or little to no interest in sex or sexual partners. Again, when we think about a spectrum, there's a spectrum. When we think about folks that identify as asexual, oftentimes people think that there is no sexual interest, but sometimes it's just little to no, right? So thinking about that as well and not cornering folks that identify in that way, or the grayscale, if you will. And there's some more information out there about that as well. Queer, a term that has been reclaimed by, and let me underscore the word some, a term that has been reclaimed by some within the LGBTQ plus community as an umbrella term for anyone who does not fit normative expectations of gender and or sexuality. So queer, right? And then when I say normative, normative in the context of what we say is the norm culturally. What does the culture say as a whole on what is the norm? You do have community members, a part of the LGBT plus community, that say queer is not for me. It was a word that was used in my oppression and I can't reclaim that. So if someone states to you that they don't want that word used around them, please respect their right to say that I don't want you to identify me in that way. Questioning, a person who is in the process of discovering either their gender identity or sexuality or both, right? There may be questioning happening on both ends, and that's okay, right? So folks don't always know how they identify and are going through a journey to see how they might want to identify. Any kind of questions on those terms so far? Any other terms that folks might want to interject? I'll add a couple of others here that you may have heard: demisexuality and pansexuality. Demisexuality is a person who needs to feel an emotional tie to another person in order to be attracted to them. So, right, emotional tie is the big thing for those that are demisexual. Those that are pansexual, people who identify As pansexual are attracted to people of all genders. Some pansexual people also describe their identity by saying gender isn't a key factor in who they are attracted to. Again, if folks have anything else they would like to add, I'm always curious to know what language is being used in other areas so I can also stay up to date. So if there are things that you want to add, feel free to drop in the chat. How many of you are familiar with this particular symbol? You can drop a yes or do a hand raise and some thumbs up. Okay. So oftentimes when we think about concentration camps, when we think about the Holocaust, we think about what happened in Germany amongst the Nazis, Hitler, and the Jewish community. But there were other communities that were also affected during that time frame. And there's an intersection, right? Those that were Jewish and also part of the LGBTQ plus community. And again, other communities that were affected. But this pink triangle that you see on the screen here were actually worn by those in Nazi Germany concentration camps. And this triangle designated folks as gay. Even before Hitler's rise to power, there was German laws that prohibited same-sex relations, same-sex kissing, embracing, and to include fantasies. Now, how you know what's going on in someone's mind is beyond my limitation of thinking, but that is how that law worked. And I think some folks are appalled, like, oh, I can't believe, but those laws are still in the books today in varying countries in our own states, some of these laws. And in some countries, the law states that those that identify as LGBTQ plus can be punishable by death, and that's perfectly legal. And so understanding what our current laws are and the laws around the world as you travel is important as well. An estimated 25,000 people were convicted under this law between 1937 and 1939. They were sent to prisons and later concentration camps. The sentences were included, but not limited to sterilization, commonly in the form of castration, and ultimately death. Over time, those in the LGBTQ plus community adopted the pink triangle in memory of those that were brutally murdered and oppressed. And that green circle was put around that triangle to say, you are welcome here, this is a safe space. So really the reclamation of what was a atrocity to the community and trying to make it now more of a positive. So if you happen to see that in places, that's what it means, is that this space has went through some sort of training. This space is welcome and opening. And again, we're not all knowing, but we certainly are supportive of the community. So something to consider in the areas that you may be in. It's easy to get stuck on myths and stereotypes. Again, I keep going back to what we learn, what and how we've been raised, and even some of the comments that we've seen here already in your personal experiences. It's important for us to ensure that we are shaking those myths and stereotypes and how we're showing up to educate others in this space and continuing our own education. I just want to take this time at this point to just kind of dive into those ongoing myths and stereotypes. What are some of the more prevalent stereotypes you all are continuing to hear, and how are you working against those myths and stereotypes? What are some things that you have been raised to know, but you've worked on unlearning? And if I can hear from just a couple folks on this, we don't have to spend much time here, but what are some of those myths and stereotypes that you kind of grew to believe, but now realize that doesn't make any sense?
I'll go.
Go ahead, Nancy.
I mean, I think you just hit on one. I mean, just religion is huge, and kind of what we hear or what we heard growing up was negative. I mean, how I personally keep myself kind of fresh and afloat is by taking stuff like this, you know, opening up, having an open mind, and you know, becoming coachable and just open to learning, because I don't know, and there is so much to learn. You know, growing up, I mean, I knew kind of like straight and gay, and that was about it. And there's just so much, there's so many layers in between, and so many terminology that to be proper or respectful, you know, we got to be in tune with this information. So for me, it's just keeping an open mind, open to learning. I've now kind of like, you know, as a grown person, keeping my own ideals and my own personal opinions and thoughts, and you know, raising my child differently, to be open and be embracive, because they are, you know, there's nothing wrong with them. They're human beings. They're just, you know, people have different intrigues and choices, and that's pretty much what our values are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Nancy. Seeing some staff roll in the chat. Regina, what is being in your feminine and masculine nature? Can you, Regina, can you give me a little bit more to that?
Hey there. Yes, thank you. I'm in the Ace hardware store, so that's why I'm leaning on the chat.
Yeah.
And I know things can get lost in the mix. In response to the question about, you know, where am I still doing work of myself and in community or in relationship to others, that component of what's masculine, what's feminine, and then, you know, characterizing that, being in that, and you know, there's this huge trend on your masculine nature or your feminine nature that's linked to gender, assumed gender, sexuality, and all of that. So identifying the things that I've been taught and have held on to in that, and then also supporting others in not feeling compelled to lean toward one or the other to feel whole or complete or, you know, empowered in themselves, by taking on these, you know, prescribed behaviors or indicators of that being in your masculine power or being in your feminine power, or loving in your feminine or loving in your masculine, you know, all of those things. So
thank you for that. Okay.
Much better than the chat version.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for engaging it. And that is, right, it's hard to not be in the binary, but it's also, right, when we think about the women's rights movement or what it means to be tapped into your femininity in a spiritual way, right, there are ways in which folks do identify and engage that is okay too. So there's not just a good or bad so much as how are we flowing in the both and. Diana, I see.
Yes, exactly. Nailed that's perfectly. Yes, the both and the fluidity of it.
Thank you. I have Diana who said, by enjoying the humanity in us all. I love that. Respect diversity, enjoy the commonality. I like that. And then Olga, that being gay is a choice. Absolutely, right? And if folks get stuck on, can you be born that way? Are you born that way, right? Again, won't pigeonhole us in that conversation. But how are we being open in our mind on how folks identify? Okay, and then the intersection of those identities, right? Well, I continue to say LGBT plus community, that's not the sole identity of how folks generally identify. That might be at the forefront, right? For some folks of color, maybe being a Black woman is at the forefront, but there are several things going on in your identity where they intersect. And so you can identify, maybe your strongest identifier is your work or being a caregiver or being a mentor. And then some of those other kind of identities flow up for you. But what we also know is at the intersection of identities, you can experience multiple oppressions and how that impacts folks. So when we think about being a gay Hispanic Catholic man or an asexual Black woman who was atheist, right? There are all these different ways and identifiers, but folks can struggle in all parts of their identity. And you know, maybe you're struggling with being accepted in your racial identity, and so you're negotiating identity and you're hiding certain identities, but you're able to show up in other spaces in other ways. Maybe if you're on a college campus, you are trying to figure out, do I join Hispanic American Leadership Organization or do I join the Spectrum LGBTQ plus and allies group? And can I do both? Or maybe you are the kid that grew up in the choir, but you're hiding your identity because you love the church so much and that particular church identity, but you can't show up as your whole authentic self. So there's these different ways in which folks are negotiating identity. But what I do know is when you have to negotiate, you cannot be authentic. And it creates a stress and level of unhealthiness when you're trying to live out your whole life out loud, but cannot. Being Jewish and Black, poly and pan and demi and femme, and absolutely. Right. And there are all these ways in which someone can identify, but there are not all these ways where folks can truly show up authentically. So it's important for us to be able to engage and understand people's identities in that way, and that they're not just one thing. And how do we continue to grow and learn? That is a quotable. Thank you for that, Regina. Intersecting identities, and these might be some familiar faces or maybe not, but folks are throughout our community, and these are folks that have decided to live their life out loud and teach and advocate and provide some resources. So please continue to read up on folks and share the people that you can continue to follow, and use the chat if there are any great resources out there and people that you're like, I've learned a lot from X. So please feel free to do that while I kind of go over who you see on the screen. We have Chelsea Manning, a transgender activist and former United States Army soldier. Some of you may remember, if you followed the news, that Chelsea endured severe bullying in their time in the Army and ultimately was convicted and court-martialed in July of 2013 of violations of the Espionage Act, amongst other offenses. And then after disclosing classified documents to WikiLeaks, she now shares her story of imprisonment and her identity through various platforms. You have J. Mace III there, who is a Black trans queer poet based out of Seattle by way of New York City, blogger for the Huffington Post, amongst other spaces. He travels and shares his story through spoken word, while continuing to advocate for queer and trans communities of color, or you may have heard the term QPOC, queer people of color, and those communities, ensuring that their voices are heard in many of the movements. Gina Rochero, a Filipino-American supermodel who is also a TED speaker. Please check out her TED Talk. And transgender-based advocate out of New York City. Rochero was the founder of Gender Proud and Advocacy, an aid organization that stands up for the rights of those that identify as transgender, and stating self-identify with the fewest possible barriers is an important quote that she runs with. I see something in the chat. Alec V. Menon is a great human I follow on socials. They bring a wonderful, colorful, emotional lens to their journey. Diego, thank you for that. Sylvia Ray Rivera, transgender activist and civil rights pioneer. She and other trans women of color, maybe you heard of Marsha P. Johnson, both of which had been credited with starting or being the instigators of the Stonewall riots in 1969, an event that helped propel what we know as the modern day LGBTQ plus movement. I would also like to add, it's important to know that there are several community actions that have happened across the country. When we think about continuing to see that movement, it's an ongoing movement. It just didn't happen one and done, right? When we think about the civil rights movement, it's not a one and done. We can parallel any movements where it's still ongoing and pushing forward. And then lastly, Jacob Tobiah, who uses the gender neutral pronoun they in place of he or she, who hosted the NBC's Out and Queer 2.0 show and has really worked to be a voice for those that are genderqueer, non-binary, and gender non-conforming. And then thank you, Tracy Elliott Page, another person we may be aware of. And also thinking about folks that have come out publicly that we may have seen, if we think about, Caitlyn Jenner, and folks have opinions on how folks come out and how they move, understanding the privilege that someone may have to be able to live their life out loud versus those that have to live their life in hiding. That being said, I want to take some time to talk about the coming out process. I think sometimes folks think it's just a one and done, but it's an ongoing process, particularly as you interface with family, peers, friends, your workplace and space, maybe places of worship, whatever organizations you may be a part of, but it's an ongoing process where you are sharing with those around you how you identify. You're disclosing your authenticity to others. And it's a very individualized process, and it can happen in stages. But it is never ending. And how do we show up, listen, and understand when someone is sharing their authentic self with us? So I want us to be reflective in this time frame. And there may be folks on this call who have already experienced the coming out process and are continuing to experience that process. So this is just an opportunity for us to reflect on what it would be like if we ourselves that are not a part of the LGBT plus community had to come out today. What would that look like for you? When you think about that, if you came out today, what would you lose? Who would you lose? And feel free to put in the chat, if you think you would have some loss, maybe kind of share who are those folks that you might lose in your life. And if you feel like, nope, everyone around me is supportive, say that too. But as you reflect, would you lose any important people in your life? And who would those folks be? I have some examples here. Would you lose a role? So the roles that you're in today, if you came out, what roles could you potentially lose? Any activities that you love that are near and dear to your heart, hobbies, places and spaces that you inhabit. And then possessions. Are there items that you think you would lose? And that always kind of throws folks off. If we were in person, we would actually be doing this on a set of cards, and you would write these things down, and I would come around the room and take these things from you, right? Because you can't anticipate every loss. And what we know is there are folks that come out and don't lose anything because they are truly in an affirming space. But oftentimes we hear, and you can really go outside your door and talk to the youth on your streets. When we think about the caregivers that they once had, after finding out their authentic identities, were then kicked out of their homes. You can look no further than, I can look out my window right now because I'm in the downtown area of homeless youth that have shared their story, that their families kicked them out when they've shared what their authentic identity was. So when you think about those losses, so yeah, that phone, the dog, the Netflix is lost when you don't have access to your home, when you don't have protections on the workplace and you come out and your supervisor is homophobic or transphobic and finds a way to fire you, right? Because who just straight up fires you for these identities, right? Because that wouldn't be legal, but people find ways. So losing your job for being authentically you, not being able to get access to homes, rent, mortgages, being able to just have a livelihood. Those are privileges that not all of us are afforded. So coming out and how to respond, and maybe those of you on the screen already have had folks come out to them. You have been that chosen safe space for them. Hopefully you showed up in a way where you were dealing with the person first, but approximately 70% of Americans know someone that is in fact lesbian, gay, bisexual, or a queer person, but only about 20% think that they know someone that is transgender. And that was as of 2017. Many of us are proximate to people across the spectrum within the community and just don't realize how people are identifying for fear of being able to share their authentic self for good reason, right? Death, loss of job, many things. So how should you respond when someone discloses their gender identity or sexual orientation to you? It's really important for you to deal with the person's feelings first. That person's trusted you and is coming to you, but it's also important for you to understand that you may have your own biases in that moment. It's not the time for you to ask a bunch of questions. Sometimes it's okay to just sit and listen. You are there to help this person go through what they're experiencing, and they've chosen you, they've trusted you to come out to, particularly if you are working with young people. How are you showing up for young folks in that space? And we'll go over some more stats here pretty soon, but just being able to use someone's appropriate pronouns and calling someone what they want to be called, seeing them how they want you to see them, can save their life, really honestly. I'm using non-judgmental language, being respectful of privacy. Just because they told you doesn't mean the world knows. You might be the only person that knows for them. So understanding the respect of that person's privacy, again, knowing your biases in that moment and dealing with those, and then being familiar with the resources, particularly if you're an organization or agency that's working with various communities. What are the resources in your area where you can connect them? It's always important to find out who is a person's support system. If something were to go on, who can you reach out to? Who are your supports? Who are your mentors? Who are the people in your corner in your life to continue to support you as you navigate your own identities? What we know, though, is whether you are homophobic or transphobic or not, it hurts us all. So when we think about the ability to form close relationships, intimate relationships with others of our own gender, when we think about young people and their sexual identities and the pressure for them to have a heterosexual activity to prove themselves, right? So the pressure to fit in the norm, the binary, the box that we put people in, how that shows up for folks. And it really suppresses the ability to have authentic relationships. When I think about some of the rapport of the young men that I've had the opportunity to mentor or work around, I think back to the time I went to the movie theater and all the boys want to sit like several seats away from each other, right? You can sit next to each other, it is just fine, right? Any other kind of stories that you all have where you realize, wow, homophobia has really tarnished this type of relationship or a thought process or ways in which there could have been stronger relationships, but folks really let homophobia seep in and stop that rapport. I'll wait a moment for folks to just kind of share how have they seen homophobia transphobia, any of the phobias show up in communities and really hinder rapport and relationships. How are we seeing that play out in spaces?
I've seen it in a treatment facility where they're there for drug treatment, and they're not respected based on their gender identity. And I think it well, it did hinder their ability to recover from their substance use.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, right. In a space where you're supposed to be getting the appropriate help. And that systemically, these are things when we are working in organizations or proximate to organizations that are supposed to be providing aid and help, regardless of how someone identifies, how does someone have equal access to the appropriate resources and supports? When we think about drug addiction, and when we think about food access, hospital, medical access, mental health access, right? And oftentimes folks have to look for those affirming offices and spaces where folks have been properly trained, but sometimes that's far and few between, particularly if you're in a smaller town or rural area, or if you just don't have as many resources to begin with. How do you provide resources to those that have intersecting identities? And this is where the work that you all continue to do in the spaces that you show up, where you're able to call that out. You know, how are we ensuring that we're providing equitable services to anyone that walks in this door? How do we provide that? Some critical facts for your consideration. Transgender youth are more likely to attempt suicide than their cisgender peers. How this breaks out: transgender boys over 5 times more likely to attempt. This is data as of 2018. Transgender girls twice as likely to attempt. Transgender people expect to live only half as long as the general population, 35 versus 78.6. Yesterday, someone asked, well, how is that likely as far as folks that are, in fact, how long are they living? When we think about the death rate, the murder rate, access to quality of life, right? To keep a job, to get some of the resources we were just referring to, you can't live a long life when you don't have access. And when you intersect community, when you intersect race and ethnicity, that also kind of adds to how folks experience life, quality of life. Transgender people experience high rates of unemployment, poverty rates, and that's higher for those that are identified as transgender folks of color. In 2020, there were at least 44 transgender or gender nonconforming people fatally shot or killed by other violent means. And that number is what is reported. Oftentimes these things don't go reported or are not reported correctly either. A lot of our states don't have hate crime laws. So also thinking about how some of these things go reported or misreported. And Human Rights Campaign has been tracking these heinous murders since 2013. Unfortunately, so here it talks about 2020 was being the highest point. 2021 eclipsed that number. So we're seeing murders, tragic murders, continue to happen at higher rates across the country and really around the world. If you want to learn more about those numbers, you can go to the HRC webpage to just see what's happening across the world. So what are ways in which we can affirm gender, or ways that folks choose to affirm their gender? But oftentimes people run with the myth, a sex change. I would say go ahead and get that out of your vocabulary and your head. Right, there are multiple ways in which folks can affirm their gender, and all of which doesn't sometimes even, because when we think about medical abilities, that's a privilege, right? Not all of us, even on the screen, have health insurance. So thinking about what that looks like, right? And that could be socially coming out to your friends, family, and coworkers, and that's really it. Using a new name or pronouns, maybe changing your gender expression. There are legal routes to make changes. Maybe you do a name change, a gender marker change on your birth certificate. There are some states that do allow that. But these can be long, lengthy, pricey processes. It's important for those that don't know how to navigate to really get with legal. And there are some law firms that are LGBT plus affirming. There is a group of folks that do some of the name changes here in Kansas for free. They work out of KU in Lawrence. So There's some folks that are doing that work if people are looking for those types of supports. And then medical, which could maybe be hormone replacement therapy, maybe a gender affirming surgery or surgeries. It really depends on how that person identifies. What we know though, that is not appropriate. It is not appropriate to ask what someone is going to do. It is not appropriate to ask someone about their surgeries, what their organs are going to be, what changes are they going to make. You wouldn't ask that of someone that is cisgender and straight. So it would not be appropriate to ask someone in the LGBT plus community. Also thinking just about HIPAA violations. I would definitely be offended if someone was asking me about any surgeries that I'm having, because it's no one's business. So just being mindful of what type of conversations you're having, and the curiosity in your head is one thing. Once it slips out of your mouth, that becomes the problem, right? So just being mindful of what we're trying to ascertain as we work alongside people. Let me stop for a moment. Any questions, thoughts, things that folks would like to interject in this space? Send my page over, we'll keep going. When we think about pronouns, and again, and just little places where folks feel like they get stuck, pronouns are used to refer to others, right? Oftentimes in the third person, we use they, them all the time, a lot more than we like to think. But in this space, when we think about those that identify in a masculine way, maybe he, him, his, feminine, she, her, hers, and then in the neutral, they, them, their. There are folks that can identify or say, I use the pronoun she, her, and they, them, meaning it would be okay to refer to that person as she, her, they, or them, right? So why do pronouns matter? Well, why do you like to be called the name that you were named, right? I like to start with that. How do you like to be referred to? What name do you like to go by? How many of us have had our name incorrectly pronounced and had to correct someone over and over again, or to tell someone, please don't shorten my name. I'm not Dan, I'm not D, I'm Danielle. Please call me Danielle, right? Or yes, you can call me ma'am, or no, I don't want you to call me ma'am or sir, right? But getting the clarification on this is how I want to be treated and this is what I want to be called. That is very important. And again, can save a life. If only one person, and this statistic came out not too long ago, but particularly in young people, if only one teacher in a school calls a child by their preferred pronoun and name or chosen pronoun and name, you can save that child's life. One person in their whole day that they see every day speaks to them in the way they want to be spoken to, may keep that child from committing suicide. And it's no different in our other communities, even outside of youth. So how are we ensuring that we're just leading with respect and calling someone what they want to be called? And I will make sure that you all have a worksheet on different ways on how to use pronouns or to get people's pronouns. Maybe you're in a workshop or you're doing a training or you have a staff meeting and you want to share your pronouns, and you could say, hey, my name is Danielle Johnson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. You can maybe share a little bit about what a pronoun is. And my favorite snack is Teddy Grahams, right? How do you work that into your conversation? You see on my Zoom screen, I have she, her, hers on there. There's a couple of other folks that have that on their Zoom screen. Sometimes in email signatures, business cards, name tags, you'll see where somebody's pronouns are stated. And that's just making it more of a welcoming environment for folks to say, oh, okay, we can talk about pronouns here, or introduce pronouns or have conversations. It's also appropriate to say, well, what is your chosen name? What is your chosen pronouns? How would you like for me to refer to you, instead of making an assumption? My dad came from Birmingham, Alabama. So yes, ma'am, yes, sir is very much in my vocabulary. So I've also taught my children that. But I've also told them if someone is offended or does not want to be considered sir or ma'am, just refer to them in the way they want to be referred to. I still push the tradition of yes, ma'am, yes, sir. However, understanding that some folks don't prescribe to that. So how do you engage with folks in the way that they want to be engaged with? Questions, comments there? Anyone wanting to share anything that they're doing specifically to teach themselves to utilize the appropriate pronouns? Okay. We're going to move right along. And for those of you that want to practice they and them, just do that on your regular basis. Instead of saying Tracy, she, just say Tracy, they, right? As an example, how can you be working on your they, them pronouns in a regular way by swapping out she, her, he, him for they, them? And then you can get really used to being able to speak to folks in that way. Regina, focus on person's name, they, them as norm. Absolutely, right? That is one way to engage, right? And also say people's names correctly. I've been around folks like, I just can't pronounce that. Work on it, right? How you practice is how you play. So it's all in the practice. How are you practicing people's names and how they identify? Laws, policies, and procedures, because what we know is there are tangible ways to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion are being implemented. Well, is there a federal law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression? Well, as of June 15 of 2020, the US Supreme Court extended Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, where in state statutes, sex covers gay and transgender employees, which prohibit discrimination on the basis of an employee's sexual orientation or gender identity. It's also important to understand that our states are a patchwork of varying laws and anti-discrimination laws or lack thereof. It's important to understand what's going on in your municipality, policies on your own books, what's going on at the state level. So just being aware of what the laws and policies state and how that shows up. Do you have any non-discrimination policies? Wichita, where I'm at, we just did a non-discrimination ordinance that includes those of the LGBT plus community. So you can't be discriminated against for housing and jobs, although there are the subset of religious spaces that do not have to follow that policy. So understanding who has to follow those policies and what that looks like. And often what we know is even if there is a law or policy on the books, folks will find a way to discriminate. So it's important for us to understand and know how those things show up and knowing our rights. And then knowing, are there any gender neutral single occupancy restrooms in the spaces that you frequent? It is not all about bathrooms, although folks get kind of stuck there. I often like a gender neutral or single occupancy restroom for family reasons, right? If you're a caretaker of someone of the opposite gender and you have to go in there and help them use the restroom, makes it a lot easier. Or if you have a child of the opposite gender and you are bringing them in the bathroom with you, or you're going in the bathroom with them, there are a number of reasons to have gender neutral restrooms or single occupancy restrooms. So thinking about that in that context, many of our households are gender neutral restrooms because everyone of varying genders uses the same bathroom. And if you're like me, and we were renting not too long ago before I became a homeowner, it was one bathroom and everybody and their mom using the same space. And it was horrid, but we use the same restroom. So thinking about it from that context, it's a lot more normal than we think. So this is another opportunity for us to engage, and I look forward to hearing some of your responses. This is just putting some of these in practice. You notice a colleague often makes comments that are subtly transphobic. It's making you and your coworker uncomfortable, but you don't know if the person realizes what they're saying is problematic. What do you do? What is your responsibility? Because it's your colleague. And they're making folks uncomfortable, subtly saying transphobic things. What will you do to correct that? Go ahead, Genevieve.
I think it's helpful to ask them questions, like, especially, it depends who it is and your relationship with them. But sometimes if you just point things out, they're going to close themselves off. They're not going to listen to you. So I think asking questions, asking them about their understanding of things, or asking them, what did you mean by that? Mm-hmm. And so that even can help if you make them a little bit uncomfortable. Asking them what particularly did they mean by that comment, I think that gets them thinking a little bit.
Right. No, thank you for that. Right. Because again, they might not realize what they said, and we can shut down a conversation very quickly. But how do we assess and ask, what do you mean by that? And did you know that that's not okay to say? Right. Before maybe we escalate it to HR, because there might be just a teachable moment there. Or maybe there's malice, but you don't know unless you ask and really assess the situation. Not doing anything about it does nothing. This person will continue to make commentary because no one said anything to them. And it becomes a norming of that behavior. Because if you let something go long enough, well, no one's ever corrected me. No one's ever said anything to me, so it must be okay. Or maybe you all align with these same thought process and ideals and you don't. Okay, you bring up the idea of doing a gender diversity training or an orientation training in your office or department or on your team, and you're met with the response, we're all really accepting here, and I don't think we need that sort of training. What do you all do with that? You're suggesting training, but folks are like, we're accepting. We have LGBTQ plus people that work here. We're good.
I think this is Diego, hi. I think a really good way to kind of introduce those ideas to folks is by how you mentioned earlier, Danielle, where you just want to stay up to date, right? You want to stay current. You want to know what the kids are using. That's what I say, at least, what the kids are using nowadays. So it's a way to just stay relevant, stay fresh. And I think with organizations, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, they can benefit from staying up to date and fresh, right, with an ever-changing market. And you can get into all those technicalities, but ultimately you want the organization to survive. And I think that's what corporations like, to stay relevant, right? And that's how we can promote those updates and changes within those spaces.
Right. Thank you for that. Right. There's no way to know everything. And right, there's a business case to be had when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Organizations that understand the bottom line and understand, hey, we're still a business at the end of the day, and our business needs to be able to intersect with everyone, is an opportunity. But also in that business paradigm is the common good. How are we ensuring those in our space are continuing to learn? Because there's no way to know everything. And then there are going to be folks that truly are not proximate to folks in the LGBT plus community. And so how do they get engaged? And across any type of topic, if you want to get better at it, you continue to get educated on it, right? There's a reason why doctors and dentists take continuing learning, and HR professionals. Laws, processes, they get better, they change. So you can only get better and ebb and flow with those changes as you are educated with what the kids are keeping up to date with, right? You are looking to recruit a potential new member to your organization, and the member is honored and love to join the organization, but they share with you that they use they, them pronouns and are concerned that they won't be accepted in your organization. What's your response to that? You're recruiting, you're trying to diversify, you want to have this person join, but they disclose to you that, hey, these are the pronouns I use and I want to join, but is it okay for me? Go ahead, Genevieve.
I would probably just point out that a lot of our members in our organization use he, she, that. Like I would point out that people use that in their titles, and it's really not that different. Like it's a safe place, and that they'll be accepted based on that, and we appreciate them sharing as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, it's important. It's also, and I'll add this caveat: know the culture of your organization and the people around the table. Is it safe? Oftentimes we want to diversify, but we've not checked the temperature. What do your policies and procedures say? What will they truly be accepted? And we would like to think, because oftentimes we love our organization so much, well, like I'm accepting, and there's 4 of us that are accepting. You got 5 supporters in the organization. But potentially you could face discrimination. You could face experiences that are not that great. But this is my commitment to you as you are brought on in this space, right? So just being honest, you never want to bait and switch. Now, there are organizations that go above and beyond. They have a pride network, they have a resource business group or business resource group, whichever language you use in your organizations. And you can connect them to folks to provide that support as well if it isn't directly there, or you can connect folks within the community. But it's always important to be informative and honest about where you and your organization is. I see Diana saying here, be sure your org is prepared and understand and respect that choice before saying so to the applicant. Absolutely. Regina was just about to type that too. Thank you. Right. It is important to prepare for the diversity that you're seeking before you get to recruiting. I mean, that's across the board. You shouldn't stop recruitment, but you should certainly have an honest conversation with your organization and see, are you ready for the diversity that you're seeking? So what is your role as an ally? And there may be several allies on this screen already. Folks are already a part of the community that see themselves as allies as well, or folks that are learning how to be an ally. Make spaces safe for LGBTQ plus communities. Understand what that means to make a space safe. Sometimes as an ally, you are going to experience some challenges as well. Now your challenge is going to pale in comparison to the person in the community. But sometimes taking a stance on these issues can create some issues for you, so being prepared for that. As always, it's important to not assume and use inclusive language to include people's chosen names and pronouns. Oftentimes when I refer to my partner, I say partner or my spouse versus husband. I'm not saying that using husband is wrong. I'm just saying if you want to use more inclusive language, you can say partner or spouse, right? Same thing with some folks don't celebrate Christmas, so you might say happy holidays. There's a million holidays in December across the world. So that's just one way to be a little bit more inclusive in your language. Respect privacy and confidentiality, particularly when you are handling business. If you know someone's chosen name, you might ask, is this the chosen name that everyone else in the office uses, before you shoot out an organization-wide email, right? We've also seen in schools or with folks that are working with young people that in their case management meetings, they're using that child's chosen name and pronoun, but maybe they're not using that child's chosen name and pronoun in front of their caregivers because that wouldn't be safe for them. And so understanding the situation in which the person that you're working with to know where and when you can use their name and pronouns. Review your organization's publications, right? What does it look like? Are you showcasing different types of families? Are you showcasing different types of relationships? What does it look like to be affirming and showcasing in your marketing material what you all stand for? Learning about the culture, understanding that the LGBT plus community has its own verbiage and culture. So how are you looking at those intersections? What wordage, verbiage are you using? And how are you celebrating your communities? How do you show up in your communities? Oh, thank you, Tracy. Yes, I thought I was sharing my screen.
I saw you reading. That's why I was like, I think she's sharing something.
Thank you for that.
No worries.
To let me go on and just getting talked at now. I appreciate that. Avoid homophobic, biphobic, transphobic remarks, right? Jokes do matter, particularly, right? Again, intersections. And maybe you are a fan of Dave Chappelle or Kevin Hart or whatever. Not appropriate, maybe on the job. Maybe not share that meme that you laugh at or that TikTok on in your organization, right? And it's important to be able to say that because sometimes folks don't know or understand, like, oh, I didn't know I couldn't share that. No, keep the inappropriate jokes to yourself, or you will probably end up in HR. Representation does matter. The spaces that you frequent, the where you spend your dollars, right? There are listservs in different spaces for you to be able to put your money into minority communities. Sometimes there are places that have LGBTQ plus chambers. There's listservs for supporting LGBTQ plus business owners. So that's other ways for you to be able to show your support, and then creating an atmosphere of acceptance in your surrounding environments and education. So something for you to walk away with as we finish up today. Action steps for you to consider as an ally or as a beginning ally. What are your goals? And what are 3 simple goals that you can put together for yourself to be a stronger ally for community? How can you achieve those goals? And do you need the help of others? What are some things you're going to do within your organization? And then come back to that list to say, these are the tangible things. We're going to look over policies. We're going to go over website. We're going to look at our graphics. We're going to do a climate study. We're going to see how folks even feel in our organization. We are going to get all the gendered language out of our policies unless it truly has to be there, right? Maybe if you're in a women's shelter, there's a need for certain language in certain spaces and settings, right? Where is the need and where is not the need, and understanding that. And who's going to hold you all accountable to that work? It's not just the diversity, equity, inclusion folks on your jobs that are supposed to do that work. It's everybody, right? If you're lucky enough to have a chief diversity officer, and not many of our organizations have them, or a committee, what are you doing to move the needle? Regina, what is the work of peace, activism, allyship, and education, right? There are a number of ways in which we can show up. And there's a number of ways that we can, while we're a part of the community or not, how do we direct people to the appropriate resources? Knowing your rights is important. So there's a whole page on the ACLU. When you think about the laws and LGBT protections for those in the workplace, EEOC has no shortage of guidelines, laws, protections on what you should know, at least what you should know as it pertains to working environment, Human Resource Commission, HRC, and lastly, what local organizations are doing the work on the ground where you're at. Here in Wichita, we have GLSEN, we have PFLAG, we have Equality Kansas, we have folks that are always working in the legislature to ensure that the laws being represented and presented are equitable, and that we're not holding communities back. I don't know if your state's like my state, but there are no shortage of anti-LGBTQ legislation that gets introduced year after year after year. And there's a strong group of folks that work to fight those laws or fight those pieces of legislation from becoming law. So who is doing the work on the ground? And then Laverne Cox, someone who I absolutely love and had the opportunity to meet and bring to Wichita not too long ago to speak, very powerful speaker. It is revolutionary for any trans person to choose to be seen and visible in a world that tells us we should not exist. So again, just thinking about how community shows up and how we allow community to show up. What is our part in the work that's being done? That's just my contact information there. And I'll end at 12:24. So some time for actual questions or conversations that can be had. Again, this is a little bit more content heavy, not as interactive as past workshops, but would love to hear anything that you all have or things I may have missed.
And she's in Kansas, so 12:24 for her, 10:24 for us on the West Coast. And of course we can take some questions, but if we can all give a virtual or an actual round of applause, thank you so much. Danielle, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you were here, this is the 5th session of 6. So we also have our final session in August. So we will be sending you out, as Danielle mentioned, some information from this session. We'll also send you the YouTube link because we record this. But again, we really thank Danielle for her time, her expertise. She's been with us for several different sessions and trainings, and always learn something new with her. So it's a pleasure to have her with us today. So if there are any questions, please take yourself off mute, or if you wanted to put it in the chat. And we could stay on, and we thank you again. And Regina asked, will Danielle's slides be available? Danielle, will your slides be available? We'll be sending that out. Okay, and so we'll be sending that out to everyone. So again, stay on if you'd like to ask Danielle some questions. Again, thank you for your time. It's a Friday morning, so we appreciate it, and hope to see you at the session 6, and hope that you enjoy your weekend. So thank you very much for joining us this Friday.
Thank you.
And Desiree asked, can you post a link to sign in? I joined really late. Stephanie, could you please post the link? Desiree, good to see you.
Thank you all.
And if you have any questions for Danielle, like I said, if you wanted to take yourself off mute or put it in the chat, we're here to answer any questions. You're welcome, Maria.
Thank you.
We'll stop recording.